Whether a student writes a research paper or a scientist studies human behavior, they're putting their morals to work. But what happens when these morals are ignored? Philosophy professor Jack Weinstein is here to discuss the importance of ethics in research and studies. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, first of all, it may seem like a simple question for people at home, but why are ethics necessary during research?
Well, ethics are necessary in everything we do. They're necessary for our interactions with other people, for the way we treat ourselves, for the way we treat the world, for the way we interact with our religion, for the way we think about our governance. Ethics is a central element of our human life, and since research is something that human beings do, ethics is something that we have to do in that realm as well.
Are there some types of research where more ethics are needed than others?
Well, certainly ethics that deals with human subjects is always key, because anything that deals with another human being is an ethical consideration. But we have to understand that there's a huge range of things that we call research that we don't think of as research, right? We think of laboratories and animals and people, but reading literature and reading the Bible, that's a form of research, and trying to figure out how to choose what school to go to or how to care for our kids, that's a form of research. And what happens in a professional situation is that these things become extended, more detailed, more disciplined, and more focused, and so the ethics issues become extended, more detailed, more focused.
Can you give us maybe an example in the past where you even talked about studying with humans in mind, where things have gone astray?
The two key examples that started a concern with ethics and research was the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where scientists injected, I think it was 80 African American men with syphilis to see what would happen without their consent. You can imagine how problematic that was. And then Joseph Mengele during the Holocaust would experiment with twins and other people in the concentration camps to see how they would react when he cut their eyes out and did all sorts of things. And so in retrospect, people looked at this and said, something's wrong here. And can we enlarge the ethical questions from the most extreme, horrible situations to the more subtle, more everyday situations?
Well, okay, that doesn't seem subtle to me when you're talking about it. So that isn't that long ago in history. What has changed in that time?
Well, a variety of things have changed, including the acknowledgement that all people are worthy of ethical consideration. So obviously in the Holocaust, Jews and homosexuals and people with mental impairments, they weren't considered full human beings. Now we recognize that they are. At the same time, we begin to think of research as something that is worth thinking about in itself, not just the results, but how do you do research and how do you ask the questions?
Okay, and another ethical research experiment, I guess, that I can remember is Dolly the Sheep. Mm-hmm. And that certainly raises a lot of questions. So was that a violation of ethics to make that cloned animal?
Well, for those in your audience who might not remember, Dolly the sheep was the first cloned animal, and there were a lot of people who were upset. A lot of that depends on what you bring to the question. Different religious traditions will have different responses. So Catholics in particular will be very, very concerned about cloning, just like they're very concerned about stem cell research. Other religious denominations might not be so concerned. So I could tell you what I think, but what's more interesting is how do we set up the questions so that we can look at the insights of not just the scientists and the inquirers, but also the traditions and the texts and the cultural context that we rely on.
And you talk about religion. Religion has guidelines built into it, certainly for the people who follow a particular religion, no matter what it is. When you have scientists with backgrounds, religious backgrounds, is that like a powder keg for an explosion of ethical
People
problems?
often think of science and religion in opposition, but science and religion works together all the time in terms of why a scientist might want to do what he or she does, in terms of the motivation of how to treat other people. But religion is just one area where ethics comes from, and how we investigate religion is also an ethical question. Religious research, for example, I'll take something controversial. People often think of Sodom and Gomorrah as outlawing homosexuality, but the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was not homosexuality, it was lack of hospitality. Most of people don't know that. And so if you look at the scriptures and if you look at the context, if you're doing research into the stories to justify your positions, then you have to treat those texts with respect as well. And that's an ethical question also. How do you teach the texts? How do you teach the background? How do you treat all that stuff with respect?
All right. So there's all this research going on. Science is going on all the time. Is there a police out there, a research ethics police?
Every organization that does research has a structure. A university has what's called an IRB, an internal review board, which looks at ethical issues, especially, again, ethical issues of ethics with human subjects. In hospitals, they have ethics boards to deal with questions like euthanasia and other such things. So any advanced institution that coordinates research will have these boards because there are ethical questions that the individual scientist or the team of scientists deals with, including questions of plagiarism and questions of honesty and questions of motive. But then there are things that a net, so to speak, to help the scientists make decision, or the humanists or the religious believers or whomever, to make decisions that might be too hard for them as individuals to figure out, and to help them deal with conflict of interest, which is a huge problem in research ethics.
Well, Jack, thanks so much for coming on. Just at the end here, you also do this sort of thing on a radio show of your own?
We do. Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life, which you can get online at whyradioshow.org. We've had Nobel Prize winners. We've had local folks getting people to ask philosophical questions every day. And if your audience wants to meet me and other people from the radio show, we're having a gathering this Sunday, a fundraiser, downtown Grand Forks at Babylon Restaurant. But really, our goal is to bring the community together and take North Dakota and unify it with the entire world. We have listeners from 100 different countries. Sure. And so people from rural North Dakota are talking with people in Pakistan about philosophical issues.
Great. Well, thanks again for coming on our show. Appreciate the conversation.
My pleasure always.
All right.